Hello everyone and welcome back to class. Today we're going to examine or explore concrete poetry. So the title of today's lesson is Exploration of Concrete Poetry. Of course, I'm Mrs. Kilpatrick, and the standard for today is by the end of grade 9, read and comprehend literature including stories, dramas, and poems in the grades 9 through 10 text complexity band proficiently with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. We're also going to cover use context, the overall meaning of a sentence, paragraph, or text, a word's position or function in a sentence as a clue to the meaning of a word or phrase. So, for the first thing that I want you guys to do today, I have attached here a copy of Suppose Columbus, which is a poem, and I would like for you guys to examine the poem and think about what is different about this poem. We're going to take about a minute, well, we'll say 2 minutes, to read through it quickly or look at it, examine it, and tell me what is different or determine what is different about the physical features or how you should read it or anything that you find that is different than a normal poem that you have read before, or all the poetry that we have been over, all the poetry that we have read. What is different about this particular poem? Just at a quick glance. So let's take a second and do that. And of course, I want you to write this down in your composition notebook. That way, when we do notebook checks, I'll be able to tell that you actually did the assignment. Okay, so now let's together read the poem. So the title of the poem is Suppose Columbus. Now if we read it, starting at the very first word, we would start at the word wrong, and we would read it as wrong Ben had Columbus suppose. Sheet this as flat was earth this suppose. God ships the and Nina Pinta Maria Santa. East to go to west traveling. Now very quickly we realize this makes absolutely no sense. The words that we're speaking, the words that we're reading in this particular order don't make sense. They don't form correct sentences. So if you were given this poem and you were told you had to read it and you had to figure it out, there are many different ways that you can begin to do that. You can look at words and start defining them. You can look at patterns. You can see that there are certain words that are capitalized where others are not, which is actually a really great clue. If you look at the words, not the words that are all capitalized, like the Nina and the Pinta, but just the words that start with capital letters where others do not. They're actually the words that are at the end of sentences instead of the beginning. Normally, in correct English, we capitalize the first letter of the first word of a sentence. Well, here, if you read it the order that it is written, the first letter of the last word is capitalized. So maybe, if that's flipped, what do you think? Should we try reading it that way, if that was the first word of the sentence? So the words are not written backwards, but maybe the sentences are written backwards. So we'll start here, where it says suppose. So suppose Columbus had been wrong. Suppose the earth was flat as this sheet, and the good ships. But now I have a problem. The Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, they're all capitalized. The whole word. So that's a different clue. This may mark importance. More importance. Of course, the entire poem is going to be important, but the capitalization of the entire word rather than just the first letter could mean that these are meant to draw your attention more than the others. Okay, we know that now, so let's keep reading. So, and the good ships, Santa Maria, Pinta, and Nina, traveling west to get to the east. Santa Maria, Pinta, Nina. Racing towards a watery cliff, and in the crow's nest of the Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria. Frightened men wanting to cry, Lando! But on the, and now look what happens. One of them are gone. We don't have the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria anymore. We have the Pinta and the Santa Maria. Okay, that's strange. So men crying only that their sister ship was gone. Okay, well, there you go. The sister ship is gone. That's why it's no longer in the line with the capitalized names of the ships. And on the Santa Maria, a crazed man crying only that his sister's ships were gone, and suddenly an airy abyss and the end of Columbus. So, the first step in this poem, of course, was to determine how to read it. So it's written differently than most poems that we examine. Even through odes or through ballads, they're all written, where you read left to right and the first letter's capitalized. This is a type of poetry that doesn't share that form at all. It every single time a concrete poem is written, it can be different. It follows different rules. Free verse, of course, has no rules, but it usually doesn't change completely and almost look like a foreign language when you first read it the way you are taught to, where concrete poetry can, which is what we see here. If you just read it in the way that you've been taught to read, it does not make sense. So the very first step in understanding this type of poetry is to figure out the pattern. It's like a puzzle. The first step is to figure out what's different. So now that we've read the poem together, I want you can reread it. I want you to reread the poem and write down in your composition notebook why you believe that the poem is written in this format. So let's look at it. If you look down the right side, it's completely straight. It's completely straight all the way down the right side. But if you look on the left side of the poem, the words make a hump. They come down in a slope from the right to the left, and then they curve out and then come back in a smaller format from the left to the right. So it makes our curve. If you also look at it, you have the names of the ships that disappear. The ships disappear. So at the beginning, first line, you have the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. You have them in the second line. You have this all three in the third line. And then you lose a ship. And then you lose another ship name. So I want you to take a minute. I want you to look at the formatting of the poem. Now that you've read it, and of course, yes, you can take a minute to reread it if you need to. And I want you to write down in your composition notebook why, right now, your first impression, why you believe the poem itself is written in this shape, this form, the way that it looks physically on the paper. Why is it written that way instead of just straight lines like other poems that we read? So let's take about a minute and a half and write that down. Okay, so now I want you to hold on to that. Of course, that should be in your composition notebook. Let's move on. So what exactly is a concrete poem? Now, you've heard me say just in the first slide, in the looking at the poem, reading it, and looking at its physical form, you heard me mention the word concrete poem and go into a little bit of detail of kind of what the rules are on a concrete poem. But by definition, a concrete poem is, it's also called a shape poem. If you've ever heard of a shape poem, concrete poem and a shape poem, they're the same concept. But it's poetry whose visual appearance matches the topic of the poem. The words form shapes which illustrate the poem's subject as a picture, as well as through their literal meaning. So basically, if I write a poem about beautiful palm trees at the beach, I may write that poem in the shape of a palm tree. So just by looking at the poem itself, you can already tell sometimes, not all the time, sometimes it's a little tricky, but quite often just by looking at the picture of the poem and never reading a word, you know what's included inside of that poem just by looking at the shape that it makes. Now, of course, shape poetry is its formal name, or informal name. It's what most people call it because, of course, it makes the shape. But it's called a concrete poem, I guess you could say correctly, because, of course, it's in a concrete shape. The shape won't change once it's made, and it links the two. So I guess it's not just a shape, any old shape, which is why, we don't really like to call it shape poetry. But it's a concrete shape. It's something important. It marks a concept. So it shows you what that poem is about. It's not just as if the words were thrown down in a random shape. That shape is made for a reason. So here's some examples. Now, I thought these were great examples. So kind of like free verse, if you look at the one on the left that says man's best friend, of course we already know without reading anything, okay, well, these words or this poem is meant to talk about a canine or a dog because it's in the shape of that. But kind of like free verse, these words don't necessarily form sentences. So I see companion, I see adopt, I see playful, I see canine, I see friendly, I see breeder, but none of them, if you read them, how they're written. So let me find a spot that I can. So there's one right here. It says companion, adopt, then it goes to retrieve. I mean, that's not a sentence, but all the words together describe a dog. Now, as we were talking about looking at patterns and things and capitalization versus size, all of those things matter when it comes to concrete poetry. So if you look at the very middle where it says man's best friend, that's much bigger than the rest of the words. Now, all the words are important. They all describe a dog, but this author probably wanted us to think that man's best friend was absolutely the most important adjective of all. It was the best description of a dog out of all the words. So this is a great example of a concrete poem that doesn't form sentences. Where we looked at Suppose Columbus, it did have sentences. This one does not. So free verse and concrete, their rules kind of coincide, but then they also have rules that are different. So free verse is usually written in lines that are sentences, but they don't have to rhyme, things like that. They can have random wording. So can concrete poetry, but it's not necessarily always written in lines. It's written to form shapes. So there's a difference in those two, to try to keep those two separated. Now let's look at the poem on the right. Now, of course, just by looking at it, we know that's a delicious looking cupcake. Here's the difference in this poem, than the man's best friend on the left. These words do form sentences that also form a picture. So if we'll start at the top of the cupcake, right past the cherry, it says, we've been through a lot. We were together. They're a little hard to read unless I print it out. And it ends with even there to help. So see, these do form sentences. So again, they're similar to free verse in that way. Each poem is its own, has its own set of rules and own set of standards that it follows. But the standalone concrete, yes, that was a pun, concrete rule is that it must form a shape. It must form an object, a picture, an image of an object that goes along with what the words are about. So if you would like to print this, you're more than welcome to. For an example, you should probably also print the Suppose of Columbus poem, because that is a very rare example of a concrete poem, because it is hard to figure out. It's not just simply follow the lines and you get the message. You have to figure out how to read it. So it'd probably be a great example if you guys would print all of these examples that I'm giving you off and bring them back to class so that you have these as examples. Okay, so now that we have went over concrete poetry and you've seen many examples, and we've talked about the rules that concrete poetry follows versus does not follow, and again, you've seen many examples and we've completed the lesson. The task that needs to be completed tonight and brought in for tomorrow is I want you to print off an example of a concrete poem, and of course that should not be one that I just showed you. So yes, you're going to print those 3 off to have as examples, but they are not going to be part of this task, so you need to find another one. Find a different concrete poem that you find interesting or that you think looks cool or awesome, and print it off. And I want that glued and stapled into your composition notebook. Before you read that poem, I want you to do just like we did with the Suppose Columbus poem at the beginning of this lesson. I want you to look at it before you read it and tell me what you notice about its shape or its physical features, and write that down. So how does it look? What is different? Does it need to be read in a certain way? How big are certain letters versus other letters? Are strange things capitalized? Look at all of its physical features and shape and everything, and write down what you notice before you ever read it. Then, after that's completed, and yes, of course, that should also be written down in your composition notebook. After that, I want you to read the poem. Read it twice if you don't understand it the first time. Read it 3 times if you still don't understand it. Read the poem until you get an understanding of it. Then, in your composition notebook, I want you to write down textual evidence that explains why that poem is written in the shape that it is in. So if I was completing this task on the Suppose Columbus, I would say the first letter of the last word is capitalized so that the reader can determine that they're supposed to read the sentence backwards. The names of the ships are capitalized, the entire name rather than just the first letter, so that you know that holds more significance and you're supposed to pay more attention to that. The poem is written in the shape that it's in because you're losing the ships off the cliff. So every time you lose a ship, it falls off the cliff, which is why there's a big hump that comes to a point, and the ship's names vanish off that point every time. So if I was completing that task, that would be a few things that I will write down about the Suppose Columbus. You do this about your own poem. Tell me why it's written in the shape it's in. Tell me why it looks the way it looks. What is proven within the text about the shape? What does the shape give to the poem and why? And you need to determine that by textual evidence. So you're going to look at what the poem's about and what it says in each line, where something physically happens to the poem the way it's written. So textual evidence that supports why the poem's written in the shape that it's in. Now, of course, this is going to be our assignment for tomorrow, is that I'm going to look over your poems that you bring in and your explanations. We're going to talk about them. We may even put some up on the board and us work them as a class. If you're struggling with it or anything like that, we're going to go over those in class. So this is going to continue on to be our assignment tomorrow. It's just going to be poems that you guys have found on your own. So it's very important that you do this tonight, and I need the poem and I need the written explanations of everything that's in this bulleted point in your composition notebook, brought to class tomorrow so that we can complete our assignment for tomorrow, which is to go over these poems. And I hope you guys have a great afternoon and a wonderful time exploring poems.